There's some underlying issues that definitely fuel disagreements between the two, I feel.
And would you have preferred Hillary Clinton then?
God, I don't know. Probably. I will definitely say that I was rooting for her. I was sitting watching the election results come in, and when I woke up and saw Donald Trump win, I cried. So, yeah, I was like, the world's going to end today. It's done. So, yeah.
So I take it you're relieved that it didn't then, yeah?
Yeah, I'm relieved that it hasn't ended yet.
We're not through yet.
What about you guys?
Do you think Bernie would have won?
Oh, I was rooting for Bernie at the beginning.
Yeah, I was too.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't follow American politics that much.
Okay.
No.
Okay, so you guys are Canadian. Do you know who Jordan Peterson is?
No.
Okay, that's okay. I'm just trying to gauge people's opinions.
Yeah.
Okay, what else can I ask you about? Let me think. Why did Obama win if racism and sexism are quite prevalent forces in the US?
Ooh, what do you guys think?
I don't know. I was so young when Obama won too. So.
I know, but I remember it was such a huge celebration when Obama did win, and I think that's because it was such a big first. But just again, I really think that politics really does have to do with the way that they speak, the way that they present their speeches, so much as like I don't really understand like the interdynamics of politics. I couldn't say, but he's just so level-headed and kind, and will analyze like a situation that's in front of him and will make it make sense for the people who are voting for him or were voting for him.
Yeah, I think a lot of politics is an appearance rather than substance. But he was quite inspirational, wasn't he? He genuinely had almost a like messianic kind of message in some ways, didn't he?
Yeah, I know. No, it's really I loved hearing him speak, and it's just like also his voice was just so calming. I don't know. I can't really say much more, but yeah.
Well, that's really interesting. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. The first one is, why do you think Donald Trump won?
Well, I believe there are large parts of the population that were unhappy with the way things were, and they felt that they weren't being heard by the previous administration. And somehow he managed to appeal to them. He managed to speak to them.
So when you say somehow, have you got any ideas on how that was done?
I'm not entirely sure, because I don't find his style of speaking very appealing. Clearly, many people did, and he also managed to rally them to go out and vote. And in the end, that seems to be, I think, more something that can yield more results than many other things here in the United States. Also in Europe, we have a problem with somewhat low voter turnout, but in the US it's even more so. And so I think if you can manage to get the people motivated to vote, I think that's something that really helped Barack Obama in 2008 to win the vote. And I think that's something that he had over his opponent, Hillary Clinton. She couldn't inspire people in the same way that apparently he could.
Do you think Hillary's lack of inspirational qualities hindered her in the run against Donald Trump?
I think that was one of the deciding factors. Because I think in many other she had many other qualities that I think made her a strong candidate. Probably. Well, mostly her experience in international matters, in politics. She's very knowledgeable, and she knows politics, right? She knows what she can say without offending the majority of people. But maybe that's also something people were tired of.
Well, I mean, what about the basket of deplorables comment that she made? That seems to have offended a lot of people.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, well, yeah, I guess she also had her at those.
How do you think Donald Trump's doing so far, then?
I am surprised that he has held on to as much of his base as he did, because he isn't, at least from my limited perspective and experience, he's not delivering on a lot of the promises that he made. But it seems that a lot of his followers are convinced that he is, and that he has. And so maybe my perspective is, maybe I'm missing some things. Maybe some things are not, they're not reported in the European media as much as they are here. I also, I'm not sure if the European media is always entirely without a bias.
I was actually going to go on to that next. Do you trust the European media?
Generally I do. I think it is important to look. You have to make sure that you look at a number of sources. I try to read a little. Well, I actually live in Switzerland, so I mostly get my information from Swiss news outlets, Swiss television, and some newspapers there. But I do try to keep up to date with German news outlets and look at the BBC as well.
Since you're Swiss, are you pro or anti-EU or neutral?
I am German. I just live in Switzerland.
Oh, right.
And I have to say, I can understand why Switzerland back then, or they have always decided to stay out of the EU. But just because it was right for Switzerland doesn't mean I necessarily thought it was right for the UK. But that also was something that...
So, do you oppose Brexit?
Well, it's not really for me to decide. It's not for me to be a proponent or opponent of. But I certainly would. I would not have voted in favor of it had I been in the UK. And I think it's not a step in the right direction for Europe. I think it's...
Why do you say that then? Can you unpack that for me? Not a step in the right direction for Europe, because it seems that that's a sort of almost hegemonic view of Europe, and if some people are voting to leave, then surely they disagree with you. I mean, what do you mean by that?
Well, I think it's easy to now look at the time when each country was on its own through rose-tinted glasses and say, see, everything was awesome back then. And I think in the end, that's short-selling the benefits that we've had as a single market, and the open borders with Schengen, and I think it'd be a shame if more and more countries start to maybe go their own way again. I think it gave Europe a lot of strength.
Right. So that's very interesting. So open borders and the single market are the primary reasons for European unity, in your view?
Well, it started as an economic partnership, and I mean, of course, now there's also the political side of it, but I guess I mostly looked at it from the economic side. Okay,
well, thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to ask you about politics. Is that cool?
Sure.
Okay, why do you think Donald Trump got elected?
He got elected because there are a bunch of disenfranchised young white males in middle America who haven't had an opportunity to learn trade skills in modern America, which is why they're suffering, because immigrants who are more qualified are taking their job.
Oh, wow, that's a really interesting answer. Okay. Do you think that their anger is justified?
At who? That's the question.
I guess the better qualified immigrants.
No. Yeah, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That's the American way.
Oh, I like that. That's the use of the Republican rhetoric against them, isn't it? That's very good. Okay, that's interesting, because a lot of people think it's racism, obviously. Do you see it as racism, or do you see it as more sort of classism?
I think, well, in America, race and class intersect, so I'd put class first. Race touches on it. But a lot of them, I don't think a lot of them actually interact with minorities or immigrants on a daily basis enough to actually blame them nationally for their problems.
Yeah, as I'm aware, like a lot of the sort of flyover states actually have very low, the majority white by a long way,
yes,
aren't they? Yeah.
America's still a mostly white country, so it's like most of the immigrant populations are in big cities on the coast. So
the immigrants aren't actually taking their jobs, are they?
No. They didn't have the jobs in the first place.
Yeah.
So,
but do you think that anything should be done to help these disenfranchised young white men?
Is that what I said?
Well, Well,
that's, oh my God, that sounds bad when you say it.
does it?
I mean, it is what it is. I think the same thing that happens with any disenfranchised is education. They need to learn new skills. They need to learn computer programming. They need to learn actual, white-collar job skills that don't exist, because blue-collar jobs don't exist anymore. So
would you say it's similar to the problem of urban ethnic inner cities in the 80s and 90s?
Yes, because a lot of those jobs left the United States and went overseas. It's a function of capitalism. Capitalism goes where labor is cheap. So it just so happens that the cities suffered in the 80s and 90s, and they've recovered, and now Middle America is suffering for what the cities suffered for in earlier times in manufacturing.
So could we call these young white men oppressed?
No. No one's oppressing them. No one's oppressing them.
And so were the people in the inner cities oppressed during the 80s and 90s?
It's a different story. Yeah, because if you're from an inner city, then there's systematic issues that came from American racism.
Are the issues facing the young white men not systematic?
Yeah. I see what you did there. I'm not going to fall for it.
I'm not from this country.
I mean, it's a different kind of systematic, because so if we're going to talk about disenfranchisement in inner cities, sometimes inner cities can be code word for minorities, right? So is that what you're talking about, minorities, or are you talking about anybody in inner city?
Well, I mean, I guess since race and class intersect so often in this country, maybe I am talking about minorities.
Okay, so if we want to talk about minorities, specifically African Americans and let's say some Latin Americans who moved here, you had people who, when slavery ended, 1865, didn't have any rights, were giving nothing, no property, right? So from there, you have Jim Crow, which locks people out of works, living in certain neighborhoods. And then, for example, when the Homesteading Act happened, a lot of Americans moved westward. A lot of black people couldn't get land. So those people could build wealth off that property. When, at the end of World War II, when the government was giving out loans to veterans, a lot of black folks couldn't get loans. You get loans, you buy a home equity, wealth. So people have been intentionally locked out of building wealth. So that systematic racism in inner cities is different from that in the middle of America with respect to race.
Wasn't that quite significantly earlier than the 90s, though?
Yes, absolutely. But you have to understand that the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1965.
So 30 years later...
You're not going to fix 400 years of systematic oppression to one group of people in 30, 40 years. It doesn't work like that.
It seems that the inner cities got worse over time rather than better, though. And it required... sort of education, homelessness, marriage rates, just economic income. And it took affirmative action programs to help build these places out of the hole they were kind of falling into. And it seems to me that the white flyover states are in the same way.
Not necessarily affirmative action programming, because
not necessarily affirmative action then, but cultural awareness, if nothing else. The sort of zeitgeist of the culture. And I'm like I said, I'm not from this country, and I mean, I 40 years ago, I would have been marching with Bernie in the civil rights movements, and so I'm looking.
You're gonna keep this part when you edit it?
Yeah, of course I am.
Okay.
Of course, I'm going to put the whole thing up. I'm not.
All right.
But anyway, so so I'm looking at historical trends, and I agree with you that these things matter. And I'm thinking that in say 50 years' time, I think there are going to be a lot of very angry, disenfranchised white people.
No, that's already happening right now.
Well, yeah, but I mean, exactly. If it's already happening now, how far is it going to be in 20, 30 years' time?
Well, we don't know how. I don't predict very much into the future, because you know how things can end up. World War III could start over trade wars that are happening right now. That's how wars tend to start. So I won't project out, but what I can say is that a lot of focus on education and technical skills needs to be focused on. You can't...
Well, on the young white men in the flyover states?
Yeah, I wish I didn't say young white men, but I'll just say anyone.
Why?
Because I think it's unfair for me to say that looking back on it now. Because people are suffering in general. Americans are suffering in general. I don't want to say... And what tends to happen is people get into this race to the bottom, effectively, when, let me compare my suffering to yours. So it's an infinite regression. So life doesn't work like that.
It's not a competition as who's the most oppressed, is it?
It shouldn't be a competition, but at the end of the day, if we're going to fix issues, we have to address them and see them for what they are.
Let's not say white then. Let's say the sort of younger, poor people in the flyover states. It doesn't matter what race they are. I agree with you completely.
It doesn't matter what they are.
But do you think there should be like government initiatives or maybe private initiatives to try and give these people better education and better prospects for the future?
It has to be a blend of both, because government's going to be ineffective in allocating resources effectively, but then also private can, in the other direction, can also misallocate resources and focus it more so with people who already have those resources. So we have to be really mindful in how it's done. It's not easy, but honestly, if I knew, I'd be doing it. But I'm chilling in Bryant Park right now.
No, I'm sorry. I'm not trying to be confrontational, but I can tell.
You're not.
I can tell you're a very intelligent man, and you're on the ball with the issues, and so it's a great thing to go through.
Because as I think about it more, it's just like, well, it's like when you know something and you know you don't know something. It's like, all right, I'm just going to stop here because I don't know anything else on how to fix.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I could theorize, I could wax philosophical about it. But,
So can I ask you about your background? Because you know a lot about all of this stuff. How do you know these things?
Oh, I studied economics. I work in tech. I work, and so my parents have a background in philosophy and social work. So I have a layered approach, and I'm a world citizen. So I've traveled quite a bit. I'm from different places. So
can I ask you about capitalism?
Yeah.
Are you in favor or are you against it?
I think that right now, it's moving in the wrong direction.
Can you expand?
So I think we tend to see it as a monolith, and it's not, because you have different schools of it. There's the Austrian school, there's a Keynesian, there's Chicago school, of economics, not capitalism. So when you want to approach these problems, you can't look at them as like, okay, I think this way, so it should be this. No, because also there's behavioral economics. So the issue with economics and capitalism is that people have theories and they try to apply the theories to people, where it should be psychology first, and then how do people respond to certain things, and they don't think about that. They create a straw man and apply straw man to statistics and to the environments, and that doesn't work.
No, I totally agree. Okay.
I didn't answer your question, by the way. But I don't think capitalism is.
Well, you kind of did by saying, look, it's not. You can't just. I mean, the question itself is not really valid in the way I formulated it, and that's fair. But sorry, did you want to?
Yeah, and I think that with capitalism, like, we need to think about. It's outdated because capitalism goes where labor is cheapest. So wherever labor is cheap, that's why jobs leave in America. It's not a function of racism. It's not a function of anti-American policies, of greed. It's like labor goes where it's cheapest and capital goes where it's best allocated.
It's a function of globalization, isn't it?
Exactly. So now they take technology into account, because what people are really losing jobs to, if anything, it's not immigrants, it's machines. You know, auto workers in Detroit didn't lose their jobs to people in...
It wasn't immigrants, it was the robots.
It was robots. So how are we going to allocate, resources now to take care of these people who lost their jobs to robots? Are these private companies who are amassing wealth and storing their cash in tax havens going to put those back into communities and back into education? No, they're not doing it. So it's where government comes in, but I don't think government does a great job of that either, because, lobbyists control the government. So
no, I think that's a great analysis. So I guess one of the things I'm finding very interesting is the rise of socialism or communism. I see it. I don't know how prevalent it is generally, but I see a lot of it on the internet, and I find it concerning, because I guess maybe it's because I'm from England, but we don't have a very positive view of communism there. I mean, what do you think of that?
Well, I'm not a fan of communism really either, because I think it's too extreme. But have you read the Gulag Archipelago? Yeah, so I understand what can happen with something like communism, but then you see what happens with capitalism as well. So blaming systems isn't necessarily going to solve anything. I do think that there's a battleground happening right now, and we need to consider that everyone's going to lose. It's not a matter of picking a side. It's like, this is a race to the bottom, and you don't want to be first.
So if I were to describe what I've perceived of your views, it seems that you're arguing for a reasonable, rational middle ground that serves as many people as possible.
I mean, in the most reductive sense, yes. I do think that there needs to be a huge shift, because we have to think about technology and its implications.
What, so towards a UBI or something like that?
Yeah, okay, because what's in economics, when you look at labor, you have capital and then you have labor. But now technology is equipment. So you have to consider, like, okay, what happens with the equipment now that the equipment is taking away from labor? Equipment's taking capital from labor. So
I mean, there are people who are talking about taxing robots, like as if
I think that's probably the most effective way to go about it. You have to tax the production, the robotic machines.
Let's start with why do you think Donald Trump got elected?
Well, he got elected because he was talking about issues that people not in New York City but in the heartland care about. Wages have been stagnant for 20 plus years. Jobs have been shipped overseas. So if you just go even an hour away from where we are right now, you will see towns and cities that have been decimated. And that's where he got his support.
Okay. Would it be an accurate guess if I suggested you voted for Donald Trump?
I don't disclose how I voted.
That'd be a yes then, wouldn't it?
No, I don't disclose, but I'm just telling you some of the things that you see that caused him to, get elected.
Do you think there are any other cultural factors involved?
Certainly. I mean, you come into a city like New York and something like religion is much less prominent. More traditional values are less prominent. So yes, you have a cultural disconnect. And then, of course, there's also, for example, here, getting a gun, very difficult. You go to wide swaths of the country, that's sacrosanct. So yeah, you have a big cultural difference.
What do you think can be done to kind of bridge that divide then?
Well, one of the best things that can be done is to really stop with this identity politics. And this is something that I think the Democratic Party has done incredibly well, which is they carve up the electorate in little segments and use it to divide people to get their support. And I think that kind of identity politics, I think, has been really divisive for this country.
I've got to say, on my channel I actually talk about that quite a lot, and you're singing my tune there. I totally agree with you. But what could the Democrats reasonably do other than identity politics at the moment? Because when I watch the Democratic nominations and things like that, it's infused with it. I mean, it looks like they can't speak any other language at this point.
I mean, I agree with you, and that's where I think, again, if you look, their base of supporters in the cities, on the coast, what we call, the coastal areas and in urban areas. But if you look, the whole wide swaths of most of the country, the more rural, suburban parts, they've lost their messaging. And one thing which is interesting is under Obama, I mean, they lost over 1,000 seats in the state legislators, which just shows that, that kind of messaging isn't working at a local level.
So that's very interesting because it looks like they're running afoul of the Electoral College then, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, that's why they're all kicking and screaming because Clinton, as you know, won the popular vote. And that's because she won states like New York and California by a landslide. But yeah, I mean, look, everybody knows the rules of the game ahead of time. And so, yeah.
Do you think there's room for a third party?
No, not in this country. No. Our system is set up in a way where, you could perhaps, like you had in the 90s, Ross Perot, got a good amount of the vote. A self-funding, billionaire could put up a challenge, but it's very, very hard. Both parties rigged the system to make it impossible for other parties to get in.
Yeah, when in the election campaign, just getting into the debates, because it seems very locked into Republicans and Democrats. It's like the Libertarian candidates seem to have quite a hard time breaking in, didn't they?
Yes, and so there's a couple things. One is, the Presidential Debate Commission sets these rules where you need, according to polls, 10 or 15% support. Something very high. That's the first thing. The second thing is, in all these states, the ballot access is decided by by the legislator, etc., which is all Republicans, Democrats. So they do not make it easy for third-party candidates and third parties to even get on ballots. So as a result, you're really in a two-party system.
So how do you think Donald Trump's doing so far?
I think he's doing an excellent job.
Can you expand on that?
Well, number one is he's doing everything he said he would do, which is very different than a normal politician. Whether you agree with him or not, he laid out in the campaign what he said he would do, and he's been doing it.
Do you think he'll win a second term?
Look, politics is a long time away. You know, you never know what happens. Obviously, I think the economy is the most important thing, and you know, the economy right now has been doing pretty well, but in 2 years' time, a lot can happen. So who knows?
Do you think it would have been substantially worse had Clinton won?
The economy?
Well, the country in general, but the economy is a facet.
No, I mean, I don't think the economy, because I don't think the president is that important, but, I don't know.
Maybe culturally?
You know, it's hard to say, you know. It's interesting because you didn't have the normal left-right election, right? So I don't want to get too wonky, but it you know.
Well, no, Donald Trump was a New Yorker himself, wasn't he?
Yes, well, he's a real New Yorker. Hillary is from Michigan. I don't know. She's from all over the place, but then they settled into New York, and then she was a senator in New York. But if you remember, as a senator in New York, she was quite a bipartisan person. So actually, I don't know how she would have turned out. She could have turned out well. I don't know.
So on the subject of identity politics, then, what do you think of what is termed the alt-right, which, as I understand it, are the sort of white side of the identity politics? Are you in favour or against?
Yeah, I don't really understand what that is. You know,
as I understand it, it's as the Democrats have been saying, well, we need identity politics for non-white people and promote these groups. As far as I'm aware, the alt-right are saying, well, we want to represent the white side of the identity politics conversation, which, I mean, in my opinion, is a bad idea. But I don't want to influence. What do you think, though? I
mean, I'm in general not in favor of identity politics. You know, I think that you speak to ideas and you speak to, you know, this is a country of a diverse country. You know, I think you make a message based on inclusiveness in general. So I don't. Well, yeah. So I don't really understand that. I don't know. I think, you know, but that's what I would say.
Okay, well, thank you very much. This is a really great conversation. Really appreciate it. Take care.